A royal name is carved into the future, long before the throne exists, and it sits there inside a Jewish scroll that outlived empires. Cyrus appears in a prophecy more than a century before he rides into Babylon in 539 BCE, a king named in advance. A voice thundering inside a temple, smoke filling the air, seraphim blazing at the edges of reality. The book of Isaiah does not whisper, it detonates. It does not simply predict. It confronts rulers, dismantles idols, and then slips ahead of history with precision that rattles modern assumptions. Most readers skim it like a collection of scattered poems. They miss the spine. Isaiah is a single story with stages, a symphony moving from judgment to hope, from city to wilderness, from throne rooms to exile, and back to a new kind of home. The manuscripts tell that story in ink and ashes. The archaeology pins it to years, names, and walls. The oldest near-complete biblical scroll ever found in the Judean desert is Isaiah, the Great Isaiah Scroll, copied around 125 BCE, 24 feet of joined sheets flowing from the king who died in 740 BCE to the promise of new heavens and a new earth. Every generation uses this book like a mirror, and the mirror keeps reflecting something sharper. The story opens with a funeral and a throne. The year King Uzziah dies, around 740 BCE, a priestly prince named Isaiah, son of Amoz, sees the Lord high and lifted up, holy, holy, holy. Smoke thick enough to sting, doorposts shaking. The coal, touched to his lips, burns and heals at the same time. His call is not a victory chant. It is an assignment into hard ground. Tell this people that their ears are heavy and their eyes dim until cities lie wasted. Not hopelessness, though. A stubborn root remains, a holy seed in a stump. The stump image sits there like a sealed capsule, waiting for a later chapter to crack it open. Isaiah steps into the streets of Jerusalem, under the long shadow of Assyria. Uzziah's reign had been prosperous. His son Jotham keeps things steady, but the mood is brittle. Northern alliances and southern fear pull Judah like a rope. The prophet delivers sharp poetry against a partying elite that adds house to house and field to field until no space is left for anyone else. He sings about a vineyard planted on a fertile hill, loved, cultivated, defended. It yields wild grapes. Judgment grows in the soil where injustice reigned. The refrain hits again and again, the Holy One of Israel. A few biblical voices use that title, and Isaiah repeats it like a drum, even while his city neglects orphans and bribes judges. The political ground cracks wide open in 735 BCE. The Syro-Ephraimite crisis begins. Rezin of Aram and Pekah of Israel try to force tiny Judah into their coalition against Assyria. King Ahaz of Judah trembles like a tree in the wind. Isaiah walks out to meet him at the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road that leads to the washer's field. The prophet brings a child named Shear Jeshubah Remnant shall return. Names become headlines in this book. The tension is simple in one sense and life or death in another. Trust in the Lord or reach for Assyria's iron hand. Isaiah offers a sign. A young woman conceives, a child with a name that means God with us. Before he matures, the two enemy kings will vanish. Ahaz chooses policy, not promise. He sends tribute to Tiglath-Pileser the Assyrian. He strips gold from the temple, designs an altar based on a model from Damascus, and writes Judah's survival with borrowed ink. Isaiah names his next son, Mahar-Shalal-Hash, Baz swift to the plunder, quick to the spoil. The name reads like a newspaper headline after a conquest. Assyria does exactly what Isaiah said it would do. It devours the coalition, and then turns its appetite toward Judah. The poetry erupts in terrifying clarity. The flood waters of the Euphrates, symbol of Assyria's power, surge up to the neck of Judah. The prophet warns about foreign alliances, horses from Egypt, carved images, priests who flatter the elite. He announces a stone in Zion, a tested cornerstone. Those who trust it will not flee. Those who trip over it fall and are broken. More images stack up. The branching oak, the burning waste, the stubborn stump. Out of that stump, in a later vision, a shoot rises from Jesse, father of King David. The spirit of wisdom and counsel rests on this coming ruler. His judgment is not swayed by appearance. The wolf dwells with the lamb. The earth is filled with the knowledge of the Lord, as waters cover the sea. In the background runs the grind of history. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria under Shalmaneser Versus and Sargon II. 10 tribes disappear into the empire. The remnant in Judah watches with dread. Siege engines roll heavy. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, launches a campaign down the coastal plain, up the Shephelah hill country, through Philistine cities, right into Judah. Lachish becomes a public theater of terror. The reliefs in the British Museum freeze the scene: impaled prisoners, battering rams, walls collapsing. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, sits on the throne now. He had rebelled against Assyria, torn down idolatrous high places, and reopened the temple. He fortified Jerusalem, carved the Solomon Tunnel to bring water inside the city walls. Sennacherib captures 46 fortified cities of Judah. He boasts on his prism that he trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. The Rabshakeh, Assyria's field commander, stands by the wall of Jerusalem and shouts in Judean, so everyone can understand. He claims Yahweh commissioned Assyria's attack. He mocks trust in Egypt. He offers deportation to a land of grain and new vineyards. The moment brims with raw psychological warfare. Hezekiah tears his robes and goes to the temple. Isaiah sends a word of quiet fire. Sennacherib will hear a rumor, return to his own land, and fall by the sword there. The army surrounding Jerusalem wakes to corpses in the night. The account says the angel of the Lord struck down one. Assyrian sources do not record a loss like that, but they admit a failure to take Jerusalem. Hezekiah's city stands. Sennacherib eventually dies in 681 BCE, killed by his sons in the temple of Nisroch. A relief in Nineveh still shows the siege of Lachish, as if that victory patched over a larger failure. The text and the stones fit together like a fractured mosaic. Judgment fell, yet the remnant lived. Hezekiah's own story turns on a bed and a shadow. The king becomes deathly ill. Isaiah tells him to set his house in order. Hezekiah weeps, prays, and receives 15 more years. The sign falls on a sundial shadow reversed, time bending backward for a moment. Envoys arrive from a rising Babylonian power, led by Merodach-Baladan. Hezekiah shows them the treasury and armory with pride. Isaiah confronts him with a future no one in Jerusalem wanted to hear. Everything shown will be carried to Babylon. Hezekiah's sons will serve as eunuchs in a foreign palace. The seed of exile is planted in a single tour of the vaults. A pivot snaps into place at chapters 38 and 39. Healing, then Babylon's invitation, then a dark promise of exile. The next line opens like a door into a different air. Comfort, comfort my people. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. The scene shifts not to 8th century Jerusalem, but to the 6th century community, far away in Babylon. The knife edge of prophetic perspective slices across time. Isaiah moves from Assyrian pressure to Babylonian deportation, and then beyond to Persian restoration. The tone changes from oracles of woe and survival to oracles of consolation. The poetry stretches into new Exodus imagery. A voice in the wilderness prepares a highway for God. Valleys lifted, mountains leveled, the glory of the Lord revealed. A shepherd carrying lambs. Exiled Judah hears promises about home, not in the sense of walls repaired, but with a remade world. Then, A name drops like a hammer. Cyrus, the Lord's anointed, a Persian king named more than a century before he captures Babylon. He is described as God's shepherd, who will fulfill divine purpose by sending the exiles home and rebuilding Jerusalem. The Cyrus cylinder discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 explains the king's general policy of repatriating displaced peoples and honoring their gods. Isaiah presents that policy not as human largesse, but as divine orchestration. This is the controversy that fuels modern scholarly debate. 19th century scholarship, with a name like Bernhard Doom attached to it, argued that chapters 40-55 emerged during the exile, and chapters 56-66 followed after the exiles returned, likely in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE. The style changes are real. The historical setting shifts. The direct naming of Cyrus stings anyone who assumes prophecy cannot name the future with such clarity. Other scholars defend a single Isaiah with later editorial shaping, pointing to the great Isaiah scroll's seamless run from chapter 1 to 66, the repeated catchphrases, and thematic unity. The debate reads like a courtroom transcript, where the defendant is the possibility of long-range prophecy. The text stands in the middle, calmly naming a king before his mother names him, then anchoring the claim in cosmic monotheism. I am the first, and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. The idols wobble. Craftsmen nail them down so they will not topple. The satire bites and glows. The heart of the comfort section throbs with 4 lyrical portraits, often called the servant songs. The first introduces a chosen servant filled with God's Spirit, bringing justice to the nations without breaking bruised reeds or snuffing smoldering wicks. The second whispers of a servant formed in the womb to restore Israel and become a light to the nations. The third shows a servant who sets his face like flint as he endures shame and spitting. The fourth gathers the strands into a staggering image of the suffering and vindicated servant in Isaiah 52:13, 53:12. He is despised and rejected, pierced for transgressions, bearing iniquities. Yet out of his suffering he sees offspring and prolongs days. The servant stands both with Israel and beyond Israel, a representative who embodies the mission and absorbs the blow. Jewish interpretation, across centuries, often heard Israel itself in the servant's voice, especially in the suffering. Early Christians read the passage as a portrait fulfilled in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The Ethiopian treasurer in Acts 8 reads Isaiah 53 aloud in his chariot and asks Philip for insight. Synagogue sections called Haftarot choose readings from Isaiah to mark seasons of comfort. This book entered the bloodstream of both Jewish and Christian communities in a way no statistical chart can capture. The servant songs sit at the center of that shared memory. Wrapped around those songs is a courtroom drama. The prophet calls the nations to present their idols and make their case. The arguments are not gentle. The manufactured gods cannot declare the end from the beginning. They require craftsmen to keep them upright. The Creator, by contrast, spreads out the heavens, calls the stars by name, brings rulers to nothing like chaff. The oracles insist that Israel's God is not simply stronger, but singular. There is no rival to displace, no pantheon to navigate. The exclusivity fuels the mission. A light rises in Zion not to isolate, but to illuminate. Those returning from Babylon will not slip home quietly. They carry a calling liquid with the weight of creation. The poetry switches into travelogue mode. A highway in the wilderness emerges. The desert blooms. Streams break out in the dry land. Jackals and ostriches become background characters in a story about reversal. The people blinded by idols regain sight. The deaf hear. The lame leap. The unclean encounter holiness and live. This is not fantasy language inside Isaiah. It is the logic of a God who made the world once and claims the right to remake it. The imagery of a new Exodus becomes the controlling metaphor. Egypt and Red Sea memory saturate the lines. Only this time the Babylonian corridors and Persian decrees set the timeline. A foreign king releases exiles and funds the rebuilding of a house in Jerusalem. This pivot to inclusion deepens as the book moves into its final chapters. Foreigners who join themselves to the Lord receive a name better than sons and daughters. Eunuchs who would have been excluded from the inner assembly are promised a lasting legacy. The Sabbath functions not just as a day to rest, but as a sign of belonging to a holy rhythm. The watchmen of the city bear responsibility for opening gates to the righteous, not hoarding access. Then, a voice in chapter 61 ignites a mission statement. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to captives, the year of the Lord's favor. Centuries later, a rabbi from Nazareth opens a scroll in a synagogue and reads that passage, stopping before the line about the day of vengeance. The timing of favor and vengeance, of comfort and judgment, sits in God's hands, not human calendars. The closing scenes of Isaiah try to hold both together. God comes to comfort mourners and to judge oppressors. The prophet dismantles fasting that parades itself while workers go hungry. He replaces it with loose bonds, bread shared with the hungry, houses open to the poor. Light breaks like dawn when this happens. A chipped moral vision in the first half of the book grows into a rebuilt civic life in the last. Another thread weaves through chapters 24-27, often called Isaiah's Little Apocalypse. The scale zooms out beyond Judah and Babylon to a trembling earth. Cities empty. The lofty are laid low. The imagery fights off cynicism by raising a cup. On a mountain, God hosts a feast of rich food and aged wine. Death's shroud is swallowed. Tears are wiped from all faces. An ancient serpent called Leviathan is punished, a symbol for chaotic evil and imperial pride. The song ends with a line that echoes into Christian funerals and Jewish laments. And anyone who breathes, your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. Wake and sing, dwellers in the dust. Isaiah is not the only voice in the Hebrew Bible to hint at a future beyond the grave, but his poetry plays a leading role in shaping hope that extends across history's graveyards. It merges with his remnant theme. A purified community survives judgment, and from that trimmed branch, a worldwide restoration blooms. The book does not ignore the mundane mechanics of power. It names Shebna, a palace administrator in chapter 22, who carves out an absurdly grand tomb for himself. Isaiah announces his demotion and names Eliakim as replacement. It sneers at Egypt's promises that float like papyrus boats. It taunts Moab's false security. It prophesies against Tyre's trading empire. It speaks to Philistia's smoke and Edom's resentment. Jerusalem receives a cryptic nickname, Ariel, Hearth of God. The city staggers with drunkenness that came not from wine but from spiritual stupor. The prophet binds up the testimony, seals the teaching among his disciples, and tells them to wait. The word remnant returns like clockwork. When the great tree is felled, the stump remains. A holy seed is its stump. The tree returns as a shoot from Jesse. The connecting tissues thicken. The manuscripts and artifacts keep pace. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, renders Isaiah's Alma in 714 as Parthenos, a virgin. That single lexical decision colors centuries of interpretation. The Greek Isaiah also reads differently in places where the Hebrew Masoretic text preserves alternate phrases. The Great Isaiah Scroll, 1 Isaiah, copied around 125 BCE and found in Qumran Cave 1 in 1000, 1947, gives a pre-Christian snapshot of the book's form. It contains minor spelling variants, small differences in word order, and at least one expanded line in chapter 53. It runs unbroken from the king who died in Isaiah 1 Uzziah, through the Cyrus prophecies, through the servant songs, into Zion's final vision. Another Qumran copy, 1 Isaiah, is more fragmentary, but confirms general stability. 1,000 years later, the Leningrad Codex, around 1008 CE, stands as the oldest complete Hebrew Bible in a single book. The distance between those two anchors tightens textual confidence. Jewish scribes counted letters. They copied in rhythmic movements. They shielded the consonants with pointed vowels centuries after the fact. The result is a text that does not feel like a telephone game. It reads like a guarded treasury with carefully recorded transactions. The controversy around authorship never settles into a neat verdict. Many scholars outline 3 sections. First Isaiah, 139. Second Isaiah, 40-55. Third Isaiah, 56-66. Others blur the lines or argue for editorial layers, as additions rather than separate authors. The book itself refuses to explain its own production. It does something more demanding. It makes a theological claim that produces the data. If a prophet announces exile in the 8th century and comfort in the 6th century and names a 6th century Persian emperor in the 8th century voice, the options become predictable. Either the prophecy expanded across time through disciples who lived the later stage, or the same prophet saw farther than his own century. The literary cohesion argues for continuity. The abrupt change in historical vantage argues for stages. The great Isaiah scroll's seam does not interrupt at chapter 40. The phrase, Holy One of Israel, runs from the beginning to the end. The vocabulary of highway, desert, and glory glow on both sides of the exile pivot. The messianic branch and the servant converge in subtle pairings. The future city in 6066 shines with a glory that echoes the unapproachable light of chapter 6. The voice that mocked idols has the same swagger when it mocks the arrogance of Judah's nobles. Isaiah ends by widening out again. The nations stream to Zion. Wealth of the seas turns to the city. The dust of travel becomes a garment of praise. The prophet looks at fast days full of strife and turns them into a blueprint for justice. He promises that light breaks like dawn when bread goes to the hungry and homes open to the lonely. He hears the Lord proclaim a day of vengeance and a year of favor. Then he cites watchers on the walls refusing to keep silent until righteousness rises like a lamp. He calls out leaders who love bribes and people who murmur against a rescued community. He envisions a new heavens and new earth. The former things are not remembered. Infant mortality drops to nothing. The elderly live full spans. The wolf and lamb feed together. Serpent dust remains the serpent's portion. The book's closing line names corpses and worship in a strange mix. It shakes off sentimental conclusions. Isaiah wants a world remade, not merely a city repaired. That world includes judgment of what destroys and healing of what is broken. The story of Isaiah also runs through the corridors of the New Testament. John the Baptist steps out of the Jordan wilderness with Isaiah's words in his mouth. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John quote the prophet again and again. Jesus reads chapter 61 at the start of his public work. Paul builds arguments with Isaiah's language about a light to the nations and a stumbling stone in Zion. John's gospel hears God's throne room in Isaiah 6 and refers to the prophet seeing glory. The Ethiopian official in Acts 8 carries Isaiah's scroll homeward after hearing Philip proclaim good news through the servant song. The final page of the New Testament, Revelation, drinks deeply from Isaiah's images new heavens and new earth, the nations bringing glory into a city without temple because the Lord and the Lamb are its light. Isaiah's voice does not trail off. It reverberates. The same voice speaks into the blood and dust world of 8th century Judah. The names ground it. Uzziah's death, Jotham's regency, Ahaz's panic during the Syro-Ephraimite assault between 735 and 732 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III's campaigns, Shalmaneser V beginning Samaria's siege, and Sargon II finishing it in 722 BCE. Sennacherib's 701 BCE campaign, with its Lachish relief, and Taylor Prism record boasting of caging Hezekiah. Merodach Baladan's tangled attempts to resist Assyria, and court allies like Judah in the late 8th century. Hezekiah's illness with the shadow on Ahaz's staircase or sundial. Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal after Sennacherib. Babylon's eventual rise under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar. Cyrus of Anshan, becoming Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, capturing Babylon in October 539 BCE. The Cyrus cylinder speaking in bureaucratic terms about restoration, while Isaiah sings of divine commissioning. Those dates and objects do not drain the poetry. They tether it to earth. Throughout, Isaiah refuses to shrink God to a tribal deity. Holiness takes center stage. Justice stands on both sides of the temple door. The outward rituals become unbearable when the inner life rots. The prophet calls leaders to defend the fatherless, plead the cause of the widow, invite reasoned repentance, with the promise that scarlet becomes white as wool. He narrates judgment not as a tantrum, but as surgery on a gangrenous limb. Exile becomes both consequence and cure. Return becomes both gift and calling. Zion grows from a hill with walls to a holy mountain for all nations. The sacrificial system moves into ethical responsibility. The Holy One judges idolatries, including those baptized in religious garb, and pulls the faithful into a dwelling of fire without being consumed. Isaiah's craftsmanship shapes this force. The book threads parallel structures, mirrored themes, and recurring words. Woe oracles match comfort oracles. Vineyard songs precede city songs. Enemies morph from specific nations into personified arrogance, then back into named kings. The imagery of a highway appearing in chapters 1135 and 40 lines up like a lit path through the text. The motif of blindness and deafness falls on both idolaters and the servant people who refuse to listen. The phrase, "For the mouth of the Lord has spoken," stamps the page like a seal. The song of the vineyard withholds the verdict and then lands with relentless logic. What more could have been done? That line from Isaiah 5 anticipates the impatience in Isaiah 1, where sacrificial smoke becomes nauseating. The same hands that push away ritual without righteousness pull close the trembling and contrite. The narrative arc is not simple linear history. It is a braided rope of judgment, promise, delay, and fulfillment that loops through at least 2 centuries of turmoil. The legacy in Jewish life fills an entire calendar segment. The 7 Haftarot of consolation, read after the fast of Tisha B'Av, come straight from Isaiah 40:66. They pour balm into the wounds reopened by remembering the destruction of the temple. They carry names like Nahamu, comfort, from the opening word of chapter 40. Ecclesiastical artists painted Isaiah's lips glowing with kohl. Synagogue walls etched lions and lambs side by side. Medieval commentators, like Rashi, probed phrases and cross-references. Church fathers like Jerome translated and wrestled with passages that did not sit easily with imperial Christianity or with synagogue tradition. Each line carried a life of its own. The scroll's material survival only intensified that effect. When Bedouin shepherds in 1947 tossed a stone into Qumran Cave 1 and heard the shatter of pottery, they cracked open a long tunnel back to the scriptorium, where someone copied Isaiah before the Hasmonean dynasty rose. Archaeologists and scholars unrolled the great Isaiah scroll in careful stages. The letters, ink, fading but sharp, ranged across the page with a sure hand. Tiny corrections nestled above lines. Vacuum sealed, time released a sigh. This kind of book does not behave like a polite anthology. It speaks with one ancient voice, in different keys. It uses names to born and bury empires. It sands down pride and polishes hope. It braids courtroom spectacle with lullaby and battle song. The images strike even when stripped of context. Swords beat into plowshares. The desert becomes a garden. The blind see, the deaf hear. the lame leap. The judge becomes a shepherd, and the shepherd wields a scepter of righteousness. The people called to be a light find themselves stumbling, then rising. The Holy One of Israel is both consuming fire and everlasting arms. A servant appears and suffers, then stands to divide spoil with the strong. A foreign king receives a title that belonged to Israel's own king's anointed, because the Lord of history lends it for a moment to accomplish a purpose. Zion sits under siege, then under scaffolding, then under glory. With Isaiah, the tension never dissipates entirely. The ending displays worshippers in the presence of God, while the memory of rebellion still smolders as a warning. The picture refuses kitsch. It insists on a world made right at a cost. The remnant remains, the thread through the ruins, through the exile, through the long road home. The stump under ash is not dead. The coal burns, but heals. The throne sits above smoke and shifting empires. A name like Cyrus lands as a claim over calendars. A phrase like new heavens and new earth pulls the horizon closer and then pushes it beyond reach. Old epics fit between the lines. The mirror that Isaiah holds up still works. Greed that stacks house to house persists. Leaders who love bribes still gather at tables. Idols that need to be nailed down look different, but behave the same. In Isaiah's world, deliverance never arrives as a loophole. It arrives as repentance, justice enacted, mercy practiced, worship realigned, trust in the unseen cornerstone instead of external muscle. The prophet shoves Israel and Judah, exiles and returnees, priests and kings into the same light. That light does not flatter, it reveals. The servant's path through suffering to vindication rewrites versions of success for every age. Isaiah heard a holy thrice-repeated chant, felt a burning coal lift guilt, and stepped into the streets with poetry that refused to stay on the page. He stood in palaces during the Syro-Ephraimite crisis and during Sennacherib's siege. His words walked into Babylon without him and welcomed the exiles home with a map of water courses through dry land. They named a Persian king and invited foreigners to a house of prayer for all peoples. They predicted a feast that swallows death and a city that needs no sun. They left just enough ash and ember in the ending to keep readers from pretending the work is finished on their watch. The stump still holds living wood. The branch still rises where no one expects life. The nations still move toward a mountain. The Holy One still speaks in a voice that shakes doorposts and tenderly gathers lambs in his arm. The book of Isaiah unveils itself not as information but as architecture for reality, standing while monarchs fall, singing while empires silence themselves, burning without consuming, speaking so that even deserts remember how to blossom.